Imagine standing in a city that was built for a future that no longer arrives. Around you, towers still rise through the haze. High-speed trains still slide into polished stations. Container ships still leave Chinese ports in endless procession. On the surface, the machine still moves. But inside the machine, something far more dangerous has begun. The property model that enriched millions is broken. Local governments are buried under debt. Youth unemployment remains stubbornly high. The population has now fallen for 4 straight years, and even as exports hit record levels, that strength increasingly looks less like confidence and more like compensation for weakness at home. For decades, the outside world looked at China and saw only momentum: bigger factories, bigger skylines, bigger military budgets, bigger plans. The assumption was simple: whatever problems China had, scale would solve them. But scale can also hide decay. It can bury bad debt under new concrete. It can hide falling household confidence beneath export numbers. It can make a system look unstoppable right up until the moment it starts cannibalizing itself. That is what makes China's crisis so hard to see. It does not look like dramatic collapse. It looks like a superpower still standing while its foundations quietly soften underneath it. This is not a story about China disappearing. It is a story about transformation under pressure, about how the model that powered the most extraordinary economic rise of the modern era is now colliding with demographics, debt, deflationary pressure, overcapacity, and strategic confrontation at the same time. It is about why Beijing keeps building, subsidizing, and exporting even as households pull back and private confidence weakens. And it is about why the slow crisis inside China may shape the next decade of global politics as much as China's rise shaped the last one. By the end of this documentary, you will understand why China's greatest danger may not be a sudden crash, but a long internal squeeze inside a system too centralized to fail quickly and too imbalanced to recover easily. You will understand how a country can look powerful and fragile at the same time. And you will understand why the crisis behind the superpower is already changing the world. The first reason China became dangerous to underestimate is that its weakness was hidden inside its greatest success. For 40 years, China built one of the most effective growth machines in history. Villages became megacities. Coastal workshops became industrial empires. Savings became apartments, roads, bridges, ports, and factories. Provincial officials were rewarded for expansion. Banks pushed credit. Developers sold tomorrow before today was finished. And because living standards genuinely rose, the model looked not only powerful, but permanent. What many outsiders missed is that China's boom was never just about productivity. It was also about velocity. Land could be sold. Debt could be rolled. Housing could absorb household savings. Construction could keep migrants employed. Local governments could use financing vehicles to bridge the gap between political ambition and fiscal reality. As long as prices rose and growth targets were met, the system seemed self-reinforcing. But it was not self-reinforcing. It was self-consuming. Each round of growth pulled future demand forward and converted it into present-day stability. That is why the property crisis matters so much. In many countries, housing is just one sector. In China, it became a national balance sheet. Developers borrowed against future sales. Families stored wealth in apartments. Local governments depended on land sales. Banks and shadow lenders were wired into the cycle. When home prices weaken and projects stall, the damage spreads far beyond real estate. It hits household confidence, local state capacity, credit creation, and the political promise that life will keep improving. China's new home prices were still falling into early 2026, showing how persistent that stress has become. At the same time, the social contract has also changed. China's educated youth were raised inside the expectation of relentless ascent. Study harder, move to the city, buy the apartment, join the middle class. But a slower economy breaks that staircase. Official youth unemployment for 16 to 24-year-olds outside education was still 16.9% in late 2025, and broader anxiety has become visible in consumption patterns, online culture, and the retreat from optimism among younger urban Chinese. This is more than a labor statistic. It is a confidence statistic. Then there is the demographic trap. China is no longer the young, surplus labor giant that powered the age of cheap global manufacturing. Its population has now declined for 4 consecutive years, with births at record lows in 2025. That means fewer workers, more elderly dependents, and a much heavier burden on pensions, healthcare, and family savings. The old growth model assumed an expanding labor force feeding an urbanizing nation. The new reality is the opposite, an aging society trying to sustain the cost structure and ambition of a rising power. This is why China's crisis was misunderstood for so long. The country did not look like a state in distress. It looked like a civilization still building at imperial scale. Airports glittered, electric vehicles multiplied, industrial exports kept flowing. But underneath that image, the machine was becoming dependent on more debt, more state direction, more manufacturing push, and more external demand to compensate for weakness at home. The illusion was not that China had succeeded. It was that success had solved the structural problem. It had not. 2. The system built for yesterday. Here is the real shock beneath the shock. China's system was built for an era of expansion, not an era of saturation. It was designed for catch-up growth, urbanization, abundant labor, rising property values, and a world economy willing to absorb ever more Chinese output. That world is fading. But the institutions, incentives, and reflexes of the old model are still in place. So when pressure rises, the system does what it knows how to do. It builds more. It lends more. It subsidizes more. It exports more. And in doing so, it deepens the imbalance it is trying to escape. The first structural weakness is debt concentration inside the state itself. China's central government still has room to act compared with many countries, but the deeper stress sits below the surface, in provinces, municipalities, and local financing vehicles built around land and construction. Beijing unveiled a 10 trillion yuan package in late 2024 to address local hidden debt, and officials later disclosed 10.5 trillion yuan in hidden local debt by the end of 2024. When a system has to refinance yesterday's political growth model just to keep today's stability intact, it is not expanding. It is defending itself. The second weakness is the collapse of the old wealth engine. Real estate investment kept falling through 2025, and major developers never fully recovered from the shock that followed the crackdown on excessive leverage. That matters because property did not just build homes. It financed local budgets, supplied collateral, absorbed savings, and created the emotional feeling of upward motion. Once that engine weakens, households save more, consume less, and trust official optimism less. The state can delay the reckoning, but it cannot easily restore the psychology that made the cycle work in the first place. The third weakness is demand. China can produce at extraordinary scale, but domestic demand has remained too weak to absorb the industrial ambition now being unleashed in sectors from autos to batteries to solar and advanced machinery. Producer prices have remained under deflationary pressure, and Beijing has openly moved to rein in destructive local subsidies because overcapacity and price wars were becoming harder to ignore. This is the logic of a system that can still manufacture abundance, but struggles to convert that abundance into profitable, confidence-building growth at home. The fourth weakness is external dependence disguised as strategic strength. China's exports help carry growth, and the country ended 2025 with a record trade surplus of about $1.2 trillion. That sounds like triumph. But it also means the system is leaning heavily on foreign markets at precisely the moment those markets are becoming more hostile, more protectionist, and more afraid of Chinese industrial scale. A country can export its way around weak domestic demand for a while. It cannot do so indefinitely if the rest of the world decides that your solution is their crisis. So this is the deeper truth. China's slow collapse is not the collapse of factories going dark or the state losing control overnight. It is the collapse of fit. The model no longer fits the age it is operating in. A debt-heavy property state no longer fits an aging society. A supply-led development strategy no longer fits weak household demand. An export surge no longer fits a geopolitical environment turning against dependence. The system still works, but it works against its own future more often than for it. 3. When economic stress turns geopolitical. This is where the story turns darker, because a superpower under internal pressure does not simply become weaker. It often becomes more strategic, more defensive, and more willing to turn economics into leverage. Beijing understands that it cannot rely forever on the old property model, so it is trying to convert industrial scale into technological supremacy. That is why China's latest policy blueprints push artificial intelligence, humanoid robotics, quantum technologies, and advanced manufacturing so aggressively. The goal is not just growth, it is control over the next commanding heights. But that shift changes the nature of competition. When China floods the world with industrial capacity because domestic demand is too weak, trade becomes strategic. When local governments subsidize key sectors to preserve growth and employment, markets become strategic. When export surpluses are used to maintain internal stability, shipping lanes, ports, and supply chains become strategic. The system stops being merely economic and becomes geopolitical, because too much domestic legitimacy now depends on outward industrial success. Other powers have noticed. The European Union moved ahead with tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The United States and its partners have tightened technology restrictions, supply chain screening, and industrial policy in sectors tied to national power. India, Europe, Japan, and the United States all now view dependence on Chinese manufacturing through a security lens, not just a commercial one. That means China's internal slowdown is feeding a more dangerous external cycle. Slower growth encourages more state support. More state support creates more overcapacity. More overcapacity creates more trade conflict. More trade conflict pushes Beijing to double down on self-reliance and national security. And that, in turn, deepens the sense on all sides that economics is now a battlefield. You can see it in chips, in batteries, in solar, in electric vehicles, in shipbuilding, in critical minerals, in data infrastructure, in every sector where scale can become coercion. The danger is not only tariffs, it is the merger of economic pressure with political insecurity. A leadership facing weaker growth, falling property confidence, demographic decline, and youth frustration has powerful incentives to define legitimacy through national mission, resilience, and external struggle. That does not mean crisis automatically leads to war, but it does mean domestic fragility and geopolitical aggression can reinforce each other. When a state cannot easily restore the old prosperity bargain, it often reaches for a harder language of destiny, sovereignty, and confrontation. So the fight is already happening, not as a single dramatic rupture, but as a slow militarization of economics. Subsidies become strategic weapons. Ports become nodes of influence. Trade dependencies become points of pressure. Technology standards become spheres of power. And beneath all of it sits the same uncomfortable fact. China is trying to manage internal slowdown without surrendering external ambition. That is one of the most volatile combinations in international politics. 4. the superpower that cannot easily slow down. If China's internal crisis deepens, the consequences will not stay inside China. A weaker property market means weaker household spending. Weaker household spending means more reliance on exports and state-led industry. More reliance on exports means more global trade friction. More trade friction means more fragmentation, more tariffs, more duplication of supply chains, and more pressure on every country forced to choose between efficiency and security. The crisis behind the superpower is not local. It is systemic. For the world economy, that could mean a long era of distortion rather than a clean break. China is still too large to ignore, too integrated to isolate completely, and too capable to dismiss. Even in slowdown, it remains a manufacturing giant, a technology contender, and a military power with global reach. That is what makes this moment so unsettling. The country is not collapsing out of history. It is entering a harsher phase of history, where internal strain and external power coexist. For Beijing, the endgame is brutally difficult. To rebalance seriously, China would need to shift income toward households, tolerate slower industrial expansion, reduce dependence on property, and allow a larger role for private confidence rather than administrative command. But every one of those changes threatens entrenched interests or short-term stability. So the temptation is to keep the old machine running with new slogans. More advanced industry instead of more apartments. More AI instead of more land sales. More national mobilization instead of more liberalization. That may preserve momentum. It may not restore balance. And that brings us to the final reframe. In the 20th century, great powers were judged by steel, oil, and territory. In the early 21st, they were judged by growth, trade, and globalization. But the coming era may judge them by something harsher. Whether they can survive complexity without turning brittle. Whether they can manage slowdown without turning coercive. Whether they can remain powerful while the model that made them powerful begins to fail. That is the real China question now. Not whether the superpower rose. It did. The question is what kind of superpower emerges when the rise runs out of easy fuel. Imagine standing once again in that vast city of glass, rail, cranes, and concrete. The lights are still on. The trains still run. The ports still pulse. The flag still flies over an immense and disciplined state. But beneath the spectacle, a quieter contest is underway. Between past and future, scale and balance, command and reality. China does not need to implode to change the world. It only needs to keep slowing while refusing to step back. Because when a giant cannot return to the old model and cannot fully build the new one, the entire international system begins to move around its uncertainty. And that is how the crisis behind the superpower becomes one of the defining stories of our time.